laundry machines. So again, consumers understand that energy costs money. They're going to make those decisions. What we want is to ensure that they have accurate access to information because consumers respond to price signals all the time, and we don't always have access to those price signals. A lot of times we don't know what the price of energy costs when we're running our dishwasher or when we are using any type of electricity source. So better information will allow us to know when there's peak demand, like right after work. And a lot of people are using their energy sources and using their energy, using different appliances that drive up the cost and the price of energy. When we have better access to information and consumers can respond to those price signals, that's when you're going to see both economic gains but also efficiency gains in the marketplace. Now I want to apply these principles with my remaining time to, make sure I'm okay here, to the Green New Deal. So again, this is what I've spent most of my time working on, just because it's been popular for all the right and wrong reasons, I would argue. But it has gained a lot of attention and changed kind of the discussion over climate and climate policy. And so the Green New Deal aims to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions. There are different ways in which different architects want to get to that policy. AOC seems to be hell-bent on doing it all with renewable power within the next 11 years, which is challenging, both technologically challenging because we don't have the battery storage capabilities to make sure that these intermittent energy sources will actually run when the sun doesn't shine and when the wind doesn't blow. But it's also just a massive, massive overhaul of our energy economy. 80% of our energy needs right now come from coal, oil, and natural gas. And so trying to massively shift that over would be immensely difficult to do and really difficult and I think antithetical to all of the principles I just talked about. I think it would exacerbate cronyism and corporate welfare in our energy markets because the Green New Deal proposes that the federal government do all of this. And so if you looked at just something like the green stimulus during the Obama administration, or even the energy bills in the Bush administration in 2005 and 2007, it was a lot of cronyism and corporate welfare in both of those bills. And again, I think these are bipartisan problems because if you're a politician, you look good when you go to a ribbon-cutting ceremony in your district and say, hey, I helped bring this money here, whether it's a wind turbine or a natural gas plant. And if you have the federal government dictating all of these investments and spending initiatives, you're going to have a number of problems with politicians and lobbyists controlling the means of production for our energy economy. That's massively hypocritical. Again, I think this is important when you think about focusing on outcomes and not outputs. AOC has quite explicitly said that she doesn't want to use nuclear power, which is by far the largest source of emissions-free electricity that we have on the planet today. So one would think if you are worried about the world ending and you think that climate change is an existential crisis, and we only have 12 years to act, you would want all the nuclear you can get. AOC and a lot of folks on the left have essentially said that we're not doing this with nuclear. So there's pretty clear evidence that this isn't necessarily just about climate change. It's about controlling more of our energy markets. It's also, I think, massively hypocritical in regard that this is supposed to be about economic justice, but it's the poorest of Americans that are going to be hurt most by this policy because these policies are going to drive up energy prices. They're going to drive up electricity bills, and they're going to drive up prices at the pump. And as I mentioned in the beginning, energy is so critical for everything we make and do that you're going to pay not just more for energy bills, but more for groceries. You're going to pay more at Walmart and Target and at the mall and going out to eat. And those costs add up. And because low-income families spend a higher percentage of their budget on energy costs, this is a very, very regressive policy. There are a number of unintended environmental consequences as a result of something like the Green New Deal too. If we were to shut down all of our oil and natural gas production and even our coal production here in the United States, that is not going to change the consumption of these resources around the world. It's simply going to shift the production of these resources overseas to countries that are less environmentally conscious than the United States. And so you're not really having a policy that reduces emissions, both criterion emissions, but also greenhouse gas emissions, in any meaningful way. And we're talking about a lot of energy production too. I mean, the United States is the largest producer of oil and natural gas in the world today. We produce more natural gas than the entire Middle East combined, and we are now exporting more crude oil than most OPEC nations. So you're talking about a significant chunk of global energy supplies that would need to be shifted overseas to places potentially like China, like Nigeria, like Libya. There are a number of countries who just do not do energy the way that the United States and the rest of the developed world does energy. So there are unintended environmental consequences from these policies as well. We at the Heritage Foundation tried to tease out what the economic cost of this policy would be, which wasn't easy to do because it's a very aggressive policy. There's not a lot of policy behind it, honestly. I think whether you care about climate change or not, I don't think this is a very well thought out plan and a way to do it. It was, to me, it felt like someone smoked some weed and then watched An Inconvenient Truth and then smoked some more weed and then said, this looks like a good plan to me. And it was like 12 pages of dribble. And again, that's not to dismiss people who care about climate change, but I think if you do, you would want to think through a better plan than what was outlined in the Green New Deal. And so what we tried to do at Heritage was just say, can we get to 100% emissions reductions in the time frame that AOC and proponents of the Green New Deal want to do? They don't really talk about how to do that. Again, we use the carbon tax in our model as well as regulations on the energy industry because that was the best thing we could do with the model that we run. And we use the same model that the federal government uses. We use the Energy Information Administration's National Energy Modeling System and just plugged those inputs, a $300 per ton carbon tax, and other additional regulations on the fossil fuel industries. And you can see the huge costs for this proposal because these policies essentially squeeze the production side and the consumption side of the economy. Producers are going to produce less, they're going to pass costs on to consumers, consumers are going to consume less as a result of the higher prices, and so you have, on a macro scale, very significant economic costs. We couldn't get to 100% emissions reductions. We got to 58% by the year 2050. And the reason why that was is we tried to ratchet up the carbon tax, and we tried to ratchet up the regulations on the industry, and the model essentially crashed. This was the highest we could go. And again, because fossil fuels are so prevalent in everything we make, that trying to ratchet them down in such a short manner seems very, very technologically challenging. At least this model wasn't prepared to handle anything like that. So when I said we measured a fraction of the Green New Deal, we measured a fraction of the energy part of the Green New Deal. I'm not even talking about the universal Medicare, universal health care, everything else that the Green New Deal aims to achieve. This was really just looking at the energy component. Now, costs are important to think about, but so are benefits. I think in any regulatory policy, you want a meaningful discussion of the cost and benefit policy. One thing I didn't mention is that there are externalities with industrial outputs. There's externalities that have adverse impacts on human health and the environment, and we as society bear those costs. And we can have discussions as to what is the best mechanism to internalize those externalities, whether it's a tax, whether it's a cap and trade type system, whether it's a strict regulation and allowing industry to figure out the best way to meet those standards. Those are discussions that I think are important to have. When we talk about climate change, a lot of times policies are, the environmental benefits are based on reduction of a certain amount of greenhouse gas emissions. That this regulation will reduce X tons of greenhouse gas emissions over its lifetime, and it's a very big number, but that doesn't actually tell us very much because carbon dioxide is colorless and odorless and not toxic. The reason we consider it an externality, and people have disagreements on how much of an externality carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions are. The reason we consider it an externality is because of its impact on warming and future warming. If you run the cost-benefit analysis and look at the benefit portion in terms of what type of abated warming you don't get much abated warming or abated sea level rise from these policies. In fact, the United States could reduce their emissions down to zero, and this wasn't just looking at 58%, this was looking at a full 100% reduction, and these are the climate benefits you get. They're almost barely noticeable and barely distinguishable between standard deviation and the background noise on the climate models anyway. And again, these numbers were calculated using a government model, the model to assess greenhouse gas-induced climate change that was developed with funding from the EPA at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. And so I would argue that the Green New Deal is a very costly non-solution to climate change. And again, this is largely the reason why, is that it's not going to change what happens in the developing world. That the rest of the world, whether the US chooses not to, is going to continue to use coal, oil, and natural gas. We see places like China and India, they are building a coal-fired power plant a week. They're going to continue to use more energy. They're going to continue to use more conventional resources that emit CO2. And nothing that the United States is ultimately going to change that. And we can have different discussions about the magnitude of climate change, the level of concern, but a lot of these mitigation strategies really are all cost, no benefit. And I think this huge push for politically preferred sources of energy, most notably in wind and solar, are just that. They are politically preferred, but they aren't realistic in terms of achieving some sort of global energy transition. Paris isn't going to change that. The Paris Climate Accord isn't going to change that. Even though countries committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions in Paris, they have no repercussions if they don't meet those targets. So most countries aren't meeting those targets. A lot of countries don't have to peak their emissions until 2030 or longer. There are some countries who have said energy poverty is a much more pressing issue for us, and so we are going to continue to build and use more fossil fuels and increase our greenhouse gas emissions exponentially. We don't really care about Paris, but here's our contribution. And so that's what you got with this international agreement. There's still very much a big divide between the developed and the developing nations, which is a huge struggle. I think people saw Paris as this kumbaya moment, but it was really anything but that. So I think when it comes to climate policy, we really need to think about a discussion on, one, the climate science, but also climate policies that may actually make a difference. And with that, I think I will shut up because I'm almost out of time and happy to take questions.
All right, yeah, we got plenty of time for questions. Before I forget, if you're in Dr. Steele's resource econ class, I have the signing sheet, so don't leave without signing it. But yes, thanks again, Nick, and yes, go ahead and ask away. So who wants to get us started?
Somebody? Yeah?
Are you familiar with the Conservative Energy Forum?
I'm not, no.
It's a group of basically free market folks, and there's the Michigan Conservative, actually it's called the Conservative Energy Network.
Oh yeah, I am familiar with
Okay,
that.
all right.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
right. Because it started out as the Michigan Conservative Energy Forum.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay.
They've got some good ideas and some things that I don't think are so good at with regard to conservative energy policy. I think sometimes they fall into the trap that previous conservatives during the Bush administration have fell into when it comes to subsidizing certain energy sources, and they want to swap out a wind tax credit and a solar investment tax credit for an innovation tax credit or a clean energy tax credit, which is marginally better in that it picks less winners and losers, and it specifies the energy source a little less than something as specific as the wind production tax credit. But I still see that as a mechanism that picks winners and losers. But that said, I think they do a lot of interesting work too. We've worked with them on trying to reduce the park's maintenance backlog, for instance. Right now the National Park System is a $12 billion maintenance backlog. Part of the problem is the federal government owns a lot of land and a lot of property. It's almost a third of the United States. And so there's a lot of cyclic maintenance that gets deferred, and then that deferred maintenance adds up over time. And so it's really becoming problematic for our national parks, which are, I think, America's crown jewel that we all want to conserve and preserve for the future. But we're not doing that because of this maintenance backlog where trails aren't being maintained, where bathroom facilities aren't being maintained, and that in and of itself, I think, is a problem that deserves creative economic solutions that a lot of members of Congress just simply aren't paying attention to. That was probably more than you bargained for when you asked about C and
Other questions? Anyone?
yeah.
What seems to be the biggest reason people aren't willing to adapt to nuclear energy? Is it just the name nuclear scares people, or is it more political, like you said, with the left? Or
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's threefold. I think one, it is there's still like a political, there's not a very much political will to change the regulatory system that needs to be changed. So right now, we have 99 nuclear reactors in the United States. There are all these large 1,000 megawatt reactors, and there's all these small modular reactor technologies that people are really excited about, both in the United States and around the world. Bill Gates is an investor and creator of one. And getting through the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's environmental review and permitting process can take anywhere from 6 to 8 years, if not longer. And so if you're a startup and you're trying to get some venture capitalist money and you're telling those VCs that it's going to take 8 years to get through this process, a lot of that VC money drops out the window. And so that in and of itself is a problem, is that fixing the regulatory process to allow some of these small modular reactor technologies to come online. The trade war certainly hasn't helped very much. I mean, Bill Gates was interested in developing this technology in China to reduce some of their air quality problems, and with the trade war going on, has backed off that a little bit. I do think that there's a social acceptance problem that I think generally the public was getting over after Chernobyl and then 3 Mile Island happened, and then Fukushima happened, and that really kind of set everything back. And now this HBO series, Chernobyl, is really, really good, but it's not quite factually accurate in everything that it discusses, which is, again, a problem. If you see people's faces melting off, that doesn't help anything. And so I do think that in and of itself is a problem, too.
Any
Yeah.
other questions?
How theoretically would privatizing the ocean actually work?
It's a great question. I don't know. Read Pete Leeson's paper. I think Pete was interested in doing it in a way that helps reduce piracy. And so I think what he saw was essentially bidding on parcels of the ocean to maintain. And so you would almost, I don't want to call it a privatized militia or like a privatized watch guard, but I think that's essentially what he was focused on. I don't think something like that would necessarily help with ocean plastics. I think ocean plastics is, again, an economic development problem where countries are incentivized to just dump plastics into the ocean, and there's no real repercussion for them doing so. And we're in a backwards way contributing to the ocean plastics problem too, not through plastic straws and not through balloons, which they now want to regulate, but a lot because of our recycling policy, which is really backwards. And NPR's Planet Money just did a really interesting podcast on this. China used to take almost all of our recyclables. And it was at a time when they had real cheap labor, and to recycle and actually properly reuse plastic bottles, you need to make sure that they're washed out and relatively clean, so you can take a plastic bottle and turn it into a shirt, and it sounds pretty cool. As the labor prices have risen in China, there's been less appetite for the Chinese population to actually clean these water bottles. And a water bottle is a bad example because it doesn't need to be cleaned. But if you've got other materials mixed in with them, like a peanut butter bottle, I guarantee you if you've recycled a peanut butter bottle, you probably haven't washed it out and scrubbed it out. If you have, God bless you. But I know I haven't. And so Chinese barge comes in, will pick up all of the plastics, doesn't want to sort through them, can't pay anyone to clean them anymore. They just dump it in the ocean. And so a lot of our municipal recycling policies are in some backwards way contributing to the ocean plastics problem. But if you are interested, I'll send you a Pete Leeson's paper, because I read it a long time ago when I took his class in grad school, and I haven't read it since. Yeah.
If we wish to stop China and India from polluting to such a degree, even if we change our own policy action, they will continue to do so.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think are some of the best means of going about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think broadly, trade and tech transfer is the best way to do it. I mean, if there's what's known as the environmental Kuznets curve, which if you've taken a resources class you might be familiar with, but essentially, as a country grows economically, it's going to emit some amount of emissions. And once they gain the resources and the means to address those resources, that's when they actually start to take the necessary action to reduce those emissions. And so, in some instances, if there's econ people in here, you think of taking care of the environment as a luxury good. And so it sounds like everybody knows what a luxury good is. I saw a lot of people's heads nodding, so that's good. Usually at other universities or colleges, there's just eyes that are glossed over, so that's really refreshing to see. And so I think part of that is just helping them grow economically as quickly as possible. They have a lot of shale resources in China, which has been a difficult nut to crack for them. Geologically, it's a lot different than what we have here in the United States, but they wouldn't build a coal-fired power plant a week if they could somehow get that shale gas out of the ground, and that could do wonders for their air quality. I think it's going to be one of those things that until, it'd be nice if their government structures changed, and if they're, the people who care about environmental quality and that they want breathable air and clean drinking water, but have the resources and the means to actually step up and demand those things. But I think that's ultimately how it's going to be driven. I'm not sure anything else that we do is going to really make a difference, which is unfortunate. No. Yeah.
So, I know when a lot of people talk about climate change, they talk about a relatively modest estimate that by the end of the century there'll be like a 2% harm to GDP every year, and that's something very manageable.
Right.
I was curious on your thoughts and Heritage Foundation's thoughts about tail end risks of climate change.
Yeah.
So maybe like 5% chance from the IPCC
Sure.
of more than 6% increase.
Yeah.
Or 6
Sure.
Celsius increase.
Yeah. I don't think it should dominate the narrative, and I think the tail end risks tend to dominate the narratives. Is that we're headed towards there's a low probability of a very bad outcome. I think too often that's what dominates the climate change discussion, and that's what people think is the norm. If you look at the people who call climate change an existential crisis, they're usually using those tail risk arguments.
And is your issue with that because you think it's misrepresented to seem like it's the 50-50% chance outcome?
Yeah, so yeah, I mean essentially I think there's going to be cost to a changing climate, there's going to be cost to a warming world in the future. I don't think we should expend a lot of resources economically on those tail risk scenarios, because you could make that argument for a lot of different things. I mean, you could make that argument for aliens landing or an asteroid hitting the planet, and then you're spending 2% of GDP on a lot of different tail risk scenarios, where I think we need to have some humility in climate science as to what we know and what we don't know, and we know that there are going to be costs, but I think some of even the tail risk arguments I think are borderline impossible. They're based on these different representative concentration pathways, and a lot of the really doomsday climate scenarios are based on this representative concentration pathway 8.5 that even a lot of the mainstream climatologists don't think is going to happen. It's based on essentially a tripling of the population growth, low economic development, low tech development, and then we pull every ounce of fossil fuel and coal out of the ground. I just fundamentally don't think that that's going to happen. And so that's not to fully dismiss a tail risk argument, but I'd be much more interested in focusing on what are strategies, whether it's adaptation, whether it's geoengineering, whether it's planting a lot of trees, policies that actually could be cost effective and even that mitigate that tail risk problem as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of going off of that last point that you just made, do you think there's any role for the propagation of carbon capture technology in helping us internalize those negative externalities with regard to pollution, or do you think it's like, kind of like solar where it's a false hope?
I'm more optimistic on those technologies than I am with solar and wind, because to me, if you use something like direct air capture, where you're essentially trying to, even suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere, those technologies and innovations, even though they're very costly right now, at least get around that collective action problem. That with the difference between the developed and the developing worlds being so big, that if you can develop that technology that gets around that collective action problem, I think that gives me a lot more hope. I think my problem is, or my concern is that policymakers are going to want that on top of everything else, that they've just put all their eggs into wind and solar. And not everybody. I mean, Cory Booker's a good example where he thinks nuclear needs to be a part of the solution. So I think at least he's someone who's a little more genuine about it. But for me, adaptation and things like direct air capture, to me, make a lot more sense as we learn and understand more about climate change moving forward. And I think we have time to understand more about climate change. I don't think there's this notion that we need to act now. I think, again, we know there's going to be costs, and I think there's going to be cost to a changing climate no matter what. I think it's better to have, and again, we don't need 100% certainty, but there are just a lot of just very big fundamental disagreements as to how the climate is changing and why. Steve Koonin, who was Obama's science advisor, wrote a really interesting Wall Street Journal op-ed on this a few years ago, and just talked about just some of those fundamental disagreements that they changed on orders of magnitude how much cost we're going to see from climate change. A big kind of debate in the climate community right now is equilibrium climate sensitivity and what is going to be the temperature impact when you double greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. There's a lot of peer-reviewed literature that says it could be close to 1 degree Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius, and there's other peer-reviewed literature that says it could be closer to 3-4 degrees Celsius, and that has huge implications for sea level rise and all of those other potential costs. And I think those are important questions that we shouldn't just be saying that it's 4 degrees, and we shouldn't be just saying that it's 1 degree. We should be having those conversations as to what those disagreements look like and why.
All right, we have time for one more. Anybody want to get the last parting shot in?
I do. Have you done a report? Senator Warren has said that if she were president, she would eliminate fracking altogether.
Mm-hmm.
Have you done a study that would estimate the cost of that?
It's our next one, actually. Yeah, and that just has huge implications, because that's where a lot of our resources are coming from now. And so I think it'll be really interesting to look at, and that's something that we can use this energy model for. It's something we never did before because we just thought it was so preposterous. But there we are, and it's been said, so I think we're going to do that. Yeah.
All right, yes, thank you, Nick.
Thank you all for
In Dr. Steele's class, sign in the sheet, it's up there on the table.